There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a nation thus before it dies. History trains us to expect something louder. We are conditioned to look for the roar of artillery, the rhythmic thunder of marching boots, the wail of air raid sirens cutting through the night. We imagine empires ending in fire and blood, collapsing under the weight of invasion, revolution, or total war. But some empires do not die screaming, some die quietly. In the 19th century, the greatest superpower of the Middle East was not destroyed by soldiers. It was not conquered by foreign armies storming its capital or by rebels tearing down its flags. The Ottoman Empire, an empire that had ruled for centuries across 3 continents, was dismantled by men who never carried rifles. It was dismantled by accountants, not by the sharp edge of a bayonet, but by the dull, repetitive scratch of a fountain pen moving across a ledger. Not by cannons, but by columns of numbers, not by generals, but by bankers. This is not a story about war, although wars were fought. It is not a story about religion, although faith shaped every decision. This is a story about math being weaponized, about finance turning into a tool of conquest, about how the banks of London and Paris accomplished what crusading armies have failed to achieve for centuries, the complete subjugation of the Ottoman state without ever occupying it. And this is not just history. This story is a warning. It is a ghost that still walks the hallways of finance ministries across the developing world today, because it exposes a brutal and timeless truth. You do not need to invade a country to control it. You simply need to own its debt. To understand how this happened, how one of the most powerful empires on earth signed away its sovereignty, we must strip away everything we know about how the story ends. We must forget the maps, the treaties, and the collapse. We must go back to the shores of the Bosphorus in the middle of the 19th century and see the empire as it saw itself, not as a corpse, but as a giant that still believed it could not fall. To an outside observer standing on the hills above Istanbul in the mid-1800s, the idea that the Ottoman Empire was dying would have seemed absurd. To the naked eye, it was still a titan. The empire stretched like a vast shadow across the map of the world, from the snow-capped Balkans in Europe, across the ancient mountains of Anatolia, down through the deserts of the Middle East, guarding the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and westward across the sun-scorched plains of North Africa, 3 continents, dozens of peoples, millions of subjects. This was not merely a country. It was the crossroads of civilization itself. The Sultan in Istanbul did not rule a nation in the modern sense. He ruled the arteries of global trade. He controlled the choke points between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, between East and West. He was not just a monarch, he was the caliph, the shadow of God on earth, commanding spiritual allegiance as well as political obedience. Caravans still crossed his lands, ships still paid tribute in his ports, foreign diplomats still bowed in his palaces. On paper, the empire remained one of the great powers of the world. But empires, like old houses, can be deceiving. From the street, the paint may look fresh, the windows may shine, the gates may still impress visitors, but if you descend into the cellar, if you inspect the beams and the foundations, you may discover something far more dangerous than visible decay. By the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was standing on rotten wood. The foundation was cracking, not slowly, not quietly, but catastrophically. The state was economically terminally ill. While Britain and France were ripping up their landscapes to lay iron rails, building steam engines that hissed and roared, erecting factories that could flood global markets with cheap manufactured goods, the Ottoman economy remained frozen in time. It was a medieval system trying to survive in an industrial age. Most of the empire's people were subsistence farmers, scratching a living from the soil with techniques that had barely changed since Roman times. Its craftsmen worked by hand, producing goods that could not compete in price or volume with machine-made imports pouring in from Europe. Ottoman markets were being hollowed out, not by invasion, but by competition. The empire looked powerful. It sounded powerful, but economically, it was already falling behind and falling fast. The Sultan's treasury reflected this hidden weakness. It was not a reservoir of wealth, it was a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The tax system was ancient, chaotic, and deeply predatory. Revenue did not flow smoothly from the provinces to the capital. Instead, it leaked away through a maze of local notables, tax farmers, and corrupt officials who behaved less like administrators and more like feudal warlords. By the time taxes reached Istanbul, half of it was gone. For centuries, this dysfunction had been survivable. The Ottomans had relied on medieval solutions to medieval problems. When money ran short, they debased the currency, quietly mixing copper into gold coins. When a powerful official grew too wealthy, the Sultan could have him executed and confiscate his estate. But the 19th century was not medieval. In a globalized, industrial economy, you could not run an empire on tricks, terror, and tradition alone. You needed capital, liquid capital, you needed credit markets, modern accounting, and steady revenue streams. And the Ottoman Empire had none of them. By the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was trapped in a paradox. It still ruled vast lands, it still commanded millions of subjects, it still claimed the prestige of centuries of conquest. But it could no longer afford to function as a modern state. The world around it had changed, and the Ottomans had not. Across Europe, power was no longer defined by land alone, it was defined by factories, railways, steel production, and industrial logistics. States that could manufacture rifles faster, move troops by rail, and finance large standing armies dominated those that could not. The Ottoman Empire stood on the wrong side of that transformation. Its economy generated too little surplus. Its tax system extracted revenue inefficiently and violently, strangling productivity rather than encouraging it. There was no reliable mechanism to turn the empire's enormous population into a stable source of state income. And yet, the demands on the state were exploding. The Russian Empire loomed to the north, a ravenous industrializing power pressing steadily into Ottoman territory. Each decade brought new military threats, new rebellions, new crises along the borders. To survive, the Ottomans needed a modern army rifled muskets, artillery, uniforms, trained officers. They needed telegraph lines to send orders across thousands of kilometers. They needed steamships to patrol their coasts. They needed railways to move troops faster than rebels could march. All of this required money, not occasional windfalls, not emergency confiscations, but a continuous, predictable flow of capital. The kind of capital that only a modern financial system could provide. For generations, Ottoman rulers had understood this danger instinctively. There was a deep cultural and religious aversion to usury, the charging of interest. Borrowing money at interest from foreign Christian powers was seen not only as morally suspect, but politically suicidal. To borrow was to submit. To borrow was to invite foreign influence into the heart of the state. The Ottomans knew that money always came with conditions, and conditions always became chains. So they resisted. For decades, they refused to enter European credit markets. They tried to muddle through using internal resources, even as those resources shrank. But resistance has a breaking point. In 1853, that breaking point arrived. The Russian Empire, sensing weakness, launched an aggressive advance into Ottoman territory. What followed was not a small border clash or a limited skirmish. It was the Crimean War, a conflict fought on an industrial scale, with mass mobilization, modern weapons, and staggering costs. The Ottoman treasury was already empty. Soldiers went unpaid, supplies ran out, mutiny loomed. Cannons needed to be cast, ships needed coal. Every day of war burned through gold faster than the empire could collect it. Britain and France, terrified that Russia would dominate the Middle East and threaten their own empires, stepped in to support the Ottomans. Their fleets sailed into the Black Sea. Their troops landed on Ottoman soil. But they did not come alone. Alongside the admirals and generals arrived another, quieter force. Men in black suits, men carrying leather briefcases, men who spoke not of honor or faith, but of interest rates, issue prices, and maturities. The bankers had arrived, and with them came the decision that would seal the empire's fate. War has a way of destroying principles before it destroys cities. By 1854, the Crimean War had pushed the Ottoman leadership into a corner. The empire was fighting for its survival against a vastly stronger Russian machine, and survival demanded choices that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Sultan Abdülmecid I was a desperate man. Inside the silk-draped halls of the Topkapi Palace, his advisors whispered a single, unavoidable conclusion: there was no other option. The treasury was empty, the army was restless, the state was bleeding. If the empire was to survive the war, it would have to break its oldest taboo. It would have to borrow. In London and Paris, a syndicate of British and French bankers presented themselves as allies. They framed their offer as an act of friendship, a financial lifeline extended to a partner in a shared struggle against Russian expansion. On the surface, it looked like solidarity. In reality, it was a contract of submission. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire signed its first major foreign loan. It did not look like a death sentence. It was written in polite language, sealed with signatures and stamps, and wrapped in the comforting rhetoric of alliance. But, if you read the fine print, the trap becomes visible. The terms were predatory, bordering on extortion. The bankers understood something the Sultan could not afford to acknowledge: desperation destroys bargaining power. The Ottomans needed cash immediately, and the lenders exploited that need ruthlessly. The bonds were issued at a price of 80. This single number was the mechanism of conquest. For every 100 units of debt the Sultan agreed to repay, the empire received only 80 units in actual cash. The remaining 20 were taken instantly by the banks as commissions, fees, and risk premiums. The Ottomans paid interest on money they never received. From the very first day, the empire was underwater. Yet when the gold finally arrived in Istanbul, heavy chests of coins unloaded from European steamships, it felt like a miracle. Soldiers were paid, cannons were cast, supplies were purchased, the immediate crisis dissolved. The Russians were eventually pushed back. The war ended in 1856, and the Sultan learned the most dangerous lesson a state can learn. He discovered that he could delay reform. He did not need to confront corrupt provincial governors. He did not need to rebuild the tax system. He did not need to modernize agriculture or industry. All he had to do was sign a document in a foreign capital, and ships full of gold would appear at his docks. What began as an emergency measure became a habit. The empire had tasted easy money, and the addiction took hold almost instantly. The borrowing did not end with the war, it accelerated. Each new loan created the illusion of stability. Each signature postponed collapse. And with every postponement, the underlying disease grew worse. The Ottoman Empire had not just borrowed money, it had borrowed time. And time, as compound interest would soon prove, is the most expensive loan of all. The end of the Crimean War should have been a moment of reckoning for the Ottoman Empire. The guns had fallen silent, the immediate threat from Russia had receded. The loans, at least in theory, had bought the empire a brief window to repair itself, to fix the tax system, to modernize agriculture, to invest in education, industry, and infrastructure. None of that happened. Instead, something far more dangerous took root inside the Ottoman elite: a psychological shift. The ruling class of the empire turned its gaze westward. They looked to London and Paris, cities glowing with gaslight, lined with marble opera houses, wide boulevards, and glittering shop windows. They saw modernity, wealth, and power, and they felt a deep, corrosive sense of inferiority. For decades, Europeans had mocked the Ottomans as the sick man of Europe. Now, the Ottomans began to believe it themselves. They wanted to be seen as civilized. They wanted to be modern. But they made a fatal mistake. They confused modernity with appearance and progress with spending. The new loans were not used to build factories. They were not used to introduce modern irrigation systems that could increase agricultural output. They were not used to build schools to train engineers, administrators, and scientists. They were spent on prestige. The ultimate expression of this vanity was a single building on the shores of the Bosphorus. Sultan Abdülmecid decided that Topkapi Palace, the ancestral seat of Ottoman power for centuries, was no longer suitable. It was too cramped, too dark, too traditional. To Asian, it did not look like the palaces of Europe. He wanted something else. He wanted a palace that would make Queen Victoria feel envy, a palace that would announce to the world that the Ottoman Empire still belonged among the great powers. He ordered the construction of Dolmabahce Palace. If you walk through it today, Dolmabahce is breathtaking in its excess. 14 tons of gold leaf coat its ceilings. The largest crystal chandelier in the world hangs like a blazing sun above the ceremonial hall, a gift from the British monarch herself. Staircases made of baccarat crystal shimmer underfoot. Italian marble lines the walls. Silk carpets cover the floors. It is beautiful, and it is a tombstone. Every inch of Dolmabahce Palace was paid for with borrowed money. While crystal and porcelain were imported from Europe, millions of peasants across Anatolia struggled to survive, with wooden plows little changed since antiquity. The palace produced no food, no weapons, no engineers, no revenue. It produced only debt. The final cost reached roughly 5 million Ottoman gold lira, nearly a quarter of the empire's entire annual tax revenue, a quarter of the state's income locked into stone, glass, and gold. To finance this obsession, the Sultan returned to the bankers again and again. 1855, 1858, 1860. Each time, the terms worsened. Each time, the dependency deepened, and the bankers were delighted. In London and Paris, Ottoman bonds became the fashionable new investment. They paid high interest, much higher than safe government debt. Investors knew the empire was weak, but they believed something even more dangerous. They believed the Ottoman Empire was too important to be allowed to fail. This assumption would prove catastrophic. By the 1860s, the Ottoman financial system had crossed an invisible line. What had once been a temporary reliance on foreign credit mutated into something far more dangerous, a self-sustaining cycle of debt that no longer depended on good decisions, strong leadership, or even political stability. It depended only on one thing: the constant arrival of new loans. The empire was no longer borrowing to build, it was borrowing to survive. Ottoman tax revenues were insufficient to cover the interest payments on existing debt. The state was not generating enough wealth to service what it already owed. Faced with this reality, the solution chosen by the imperial court was not reform, austerity, or restructuring. It was more borrowing. New loans were taken out to pay the interest on old ones. Fresh cash flowed into the treasury, and almost immediately flowed back out again to European bond holders. The state was digging a hole to fill a hole, and with every shovel of dirt, the grave grew deeper. This was not mismanagement, it was mathematics. In 1860, debt service consumed roughly 15% of state revenue. Painful, but manageable. A decade later, that figure had exploded past 50%. More than half of all money collected by the empire was no longer available for governance. Let that number sink in. Every coin paid by a Greek fisherman, a Bulgarian shepherd, or a spice merchant in Damascus, half of it vanished the moment it reached the treasury. It did not build roads. It did not maintain fortresses. It did not pay soldiers. It was wired directly to coupon clippers in London and rentiers in Paris. The Ottoman state was being hollowed out from the inside. There was no money left for the army, no money for the navy, no money to maintain the very infrastructure that allowed the economy to function. And when emergencies arose, as they always do, there was nothing left to draw upon. To keep the system alive, the government turned inward, to the financial predators closest at hand. In the Galata district of Istanbul lived a powerful group of financiers, mostly Greek, Armenian, and Jewish bankers who specialized in short-term, high-interest lending. They became the empire's lenders of last resort. When the treasury ran dry weeks before a major European payment was due, the Grand Vizier would walk the short distance to Galata and borrow at rates of 18, 20, sometimes even 25%. It was financial suicide, but suicide, in slow motion, felt like survival. At the same time, a new sultan ascended the throne, Abdulaziz. If his predecessor had been addicted to palaces, Abdulaziz was addicted to military hardware. He was obsessed with prestige, power, and appearances, especially naval power. He looked at the British Royal Navy and felt envy. He ordered massive ironclad warships from British shipyards. He purchased state-of-the-art steel cannons from Krupp in Germany. On paper, the Ottoman Navy became the third largest in the world. In reality, it was a fleet of debt. The empire could not afford the coal to fuel the ships or the engineers to maintain them. They sat anchored in the Golden Horn, rusting in the water, impressive silhouettes masking total paralysis. They were the perfect metaphor for the Ottoman Empire itself, and then the flow of money stopped. In systems built on debt, collapse rarely comes from a single blow. It comes when several failures arrive at the same time. In 1873, the first shock struck far from Istanbul. A financial panic erupted in Vienna, triggered by the collapse of speculative investments and overextended banks. What began as a regional crisis spread rapidly through Europe and across the Atlantic. Global credit markets froze, investors panicked, capital fled risk. In London and Paris, bond buyers suddenly lost their appetite for foreign debt, especially the kind issued by fragile empires with collapsing finances. For the Ottoman state, this was fatal. The Ponzi system that kept the empire functioning required one essential ingredient: a steady stream of new money. When that stream dried up, the entire structure began to crumble. At the exact same moment, nature delivered the second blow. In 1873 and 1874, a devastating drought struck the heartland of Anatolia. Rain failed, crops withered in the fields, wheat harvests collapsed, livestock died by the thousands. Famine crept across the countryside. The peasants who formed the tax base of the empire began to starve. When tax collectors arrived in villages demanding the sultan's share, they found empty granaries, barren land, and corpses. Revenue collapsed precisely when the state needed it most. By the summer of 1875, the situation in Istanbul was desperate. The Grand Vizier, Mahmud Nedim Pasha, sat before the ledgers and saw the truth written in red ink. The treasury was empty. A massive payment to European bond holders was due in October. There was no money. He attempted the one thing the empire had relied on for 2 decades, raising another loan. He sent envoys to European banks. He pleaded. He negotiated. The doors were slammed shut. No one would lend to the sick man of Europe anymore. The Ottoman government faced a brutal choice. It could squeeze its starving population even harder to meet foreign obligations, or it could do the unthinkable and stop paying. On October 6, 1875, it chose default. The government issued what became known as the Decree of Ramadan. In polite diplomatic language, it announced a moratorium on debt payments. In financial reality, it declared bankruptcy. The empire would pay only half of what it owed, 50% in cash. The rest in paper, IOS promising future returns. Europe understood the message immediately. The Ottoman Empire was insolvent. The reaction was explosive. Across Britain and France, millions of middle-class investors, shopkeepers, clerks, widows, and pensioners had poured their savings into Ottoman bonds, chasing high yields. Overnight, their wealth evaporated. Newspapers screamed for punishment. The Turks were painted as thieves, swindlers, and barbarians. Sympathy vanished. The diplomatic shield that Britain and France had extended to protect the Ottomans disintegrated. And in geopolitics, weakness is like blood in the water. Russia was watching. From the north, the Russian Empire observed the Ottoman collapse with cold precision. Russia had failed to break the Ottomans during the Crimean War, but now it saw something far more valuable than a military opening. It saw a bankrupt, isolated state stripped of its allies and credibility. The Sultan had lost not just his gold, but his diplomatic protection. In 1877, Russia moved. The Russo-Turkish War was swift and devastating. Ottoman soldiers fought with courage and endurance, but courage does not replace logistics. The army was underpaid, undersupplied, and often starving. Ammunition was scarce, equipment was outdated, command was chaotic, the treasury was empty. Russian forces advanced deep into Ottoman territory, rolling over exhausted defenses. Within months, they reached the outskirts of Istanbul. From their positions, Russian officers could see the minarets of Hagia Sophia through their binoculars. The empire was on its knees. The resulting peace treaty was a humiliation. Vast territories in the Balkans and the Caucasus were surrendered. Entire provinces, cultivated and taxed for centuries, were lost in a stroke of the pen. But the most devastating clause of the treaty was not about land, it was about money. Russia imposed a colossal war indemnity over 800 million francs, an astronomical sum for a state that had already defaulted on its existing debts. The Ottomans were now trapped between two impossible obligations. They owed hundreds of millions to British and French bankers, and they owed a mountain of gold to the Russian Tsar. The combined debt exceeded the total value of the Ottoman economy. The empire was not merely bankrupt. It was insolvent. It had no credit, no reserves, no leverage. When Sultan Abdulhamid II ascended the throne amid this chaos, he understood the reality immediately. He was the ruler of a corpse. The question was no longer whether the empire would be dismantled, but how. He expected invasion, partition, foreign occupation. Instead, Europe chose something far more efficient. Europe did not march on Istanbul. It didn't need to. By the early 1880s, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a sovereign financial entity. It could not borrow. It could not pay. It could not even accurately measure its own revenues. Every door to traditional diplomacy had closed. So the solution proposed by Europe was framed as assistance. In 1881, the Ottoman government was presented with an offer it could not refuse: the creation of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. On paper, this institution was a compromise, a neutral, technocratic body designed to stabilize the empire's finances, reassure creditors, and gradually restore fiscal order. In reality, it was a foreign occupation without soldiers. The administration was not Ottoman. It was controlled almost entirely by representatives of Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and the Netherlands. These men did not answer to the Sultan. They answered to bondholders in Paris and London. Their authority was absolute. The Ottoman state was forced to hand over direct control of its most reliable revenue streams: taxes on salt, tobacco monopolies, customs duties, stamp taxes, alcohol excises. Entire provinces were placed under foreign fiscal supervision. For the first time in history, a sovereign empire no longer controlled its own tax system. The administration built its own offices across Ottoman territory. It hired its own inspectors. It employed over 9,000 officials, many more than the Ottoman Ministry of Finance itself. The Sultan still ruled, but he did not govern. Every lira collected by the state passed through foreign hands first. Debt service was paid before soldiers, before teachers, before infrastructure, before famine relief. The empire existed to feed its creditors. This was not colonialism in the traditional sense. No flags were raised. No governors were replaced. No official annexations were declared. But make no mistake, this was conquest. A conquest so complete that it didn't even require violence. And the most tragic part was this: the system worked. From the perspective of Europe, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration was a success. Bondholders were paid. Markets stabilized. Confidence returned. From the perspective of the empire, it was a slow suffocation. By the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had entered a strange and deeply unsettling phase of its existence. On maps, it still looked like a great power. Its borders stretched across Anatolia, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and parts of Arabia. The Sultan still sat on his throne in Istanbul. The bureaucracy still functioned. Laws were passed, armies marched, flags flew. But none of it mattered, because the core function of a state control over its own future had been quietly removed. Every major decision now passed through an invisible filter. Would this anger the creditors? Could the empire build railways? Only if the debt administration approved. Could it modernize the army? Only if debt payments were not threatened. Could it raise taxes to fund reforms? Not without foreign consent. Economic policy had become hostage policy, even when Ottoman leaders understood exactly what needed to be done to save the state. They lacked the authority to do it. Reform was not impossible, it was forbidden. And so decline accelerated, public investment collapsed. Infrastructure lagged behind Europe by decades. Education stagnated. Industrialization never took root. While Germany unified and electrified, while Britain and France expanded their empires, the Ottomans remained trapped in a low-growth, high-debt equilibrium designed not for development, but for extraction. The population felt it immediately. Taxes were high, but services vanished. Famine relief was underfunded. Soldiers went unpaid. Provincial resentment exploded. Ethnic and nationalist movements gained traction, not because ideology had suddenly changed, but because the state could no longer deliver stability or prosperity. And yet, from the outside, Europe praised the system. Editorials in London called the Ottoman finances responsibly managed. French bankers celebrated the reliability of Ottoman bonds. To investors, the empire had finally become disciplined. Discipline means obedient. This was the ultimate irony. The Ottoman state was now financially healthier on paper than it had been in decades, even as its society rotted from within. It would survive like this for over 30 years. But a hollow state cannot withstand a global shock. And in 1914, the shock arrived. When the First World War erupted in the summer of 1914, most European capitals reacted with confidence. The Ottoman Empire reacted with desperation. By this point, Ottoman leaders understood a brutal truth. Peace was killing them faster than war ever could. As long as the empire remained financially entangled with Europe, there was no path back to sovereignty, no reform, no gradual recovery, no internal renaissance could occur under foreign fiscal control. The debt system was permanent. So the war presented something paradoxical, an opportunity. If the empire stayed neutral, it would continue to bleed slowly under the supervision of its creditors. If it entered the war and lost, it would be destroyed. But if it entered the war and somehow won, the entire financial architecture imposed by Europe could be swept away. It was not a strategic gamble, it was a last roll of the dice. Aligning with Germany offered the Ottomans a chance to break the British-French financial stranglehold. German loans came without the same humiliating oversight. German officers modernized Ottoman forces. German diplomacy promised respect, not management. For the first time in decades, Istanbul saw a path, however narrow, toward autonomy. The cost was catastrophic. War devastated the empire. Millions died from combat, famine, and disease. Infrastructure collapsed. Entire regions were depopulated. Revolts erupted. Supply lines disintegrated. But even in defeat, the Ottomans achieved something unexpected. The debt system cracked. European creditors could not enforce repayments during total war. The public debt administration ceased to function as intended. Financial control slipped. The empire itself would not survive the conflict. But its chains would not survive it either. The Ottoman Empire did not survive the First World War. By 1922, the Sultanate was abolished. A state that had ruled vast territories for more than 600 years disappeared from the map. Its lands were carved up by treaties, mandates, and new borders drawn in European capitals. But something else died with it, the illusion that sovereignty is protected by flags, armies, or history alone. The Ottomans did not fall because they were weak, backward, or incapable of reform. They fell because they surrendered control over their finances long before they lost control over their borders. Long before enemy troops reached their capital, foreign creditors had already taken possession of the state's bloodstream. By the time the cannons fired, the empire was already dead. This is the uncomfortable lesson history prefers to forget. Debt is not neutral, it is power. And when debt is structured correctly, it can achieve what violence cannot: total compliance without occupation. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration became the blueprint. In the 20th and 21st centuries, its logic would be repeated again and again. In Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, under new names, with new institutions, and with better public relations, but with the same core principle intact. Control the revenue, control the policy, control the future. Modern empires no longer need colonies, they need balance sheets, and modern conquests rarely involve soldiers. They involve conditional loans, austerity mandates, and technocratic assistance that arrives wrapped in the language of stability and reform. The Ottoman Empire's mistake was not borrowing. It was believing that debt could be separated from sovereignty. History proved otherwise, because once a nation loses the right to decide how its money is collected and spent, everything else, its laws, its borders, even its existence, becomes negotiable. Empires do not always collapse in flames. Some are simply audited to death.